Hello, this is Dr. Ross, and this is the video lecture on homeostasis. This is for my Anatomy and Physiology 1 class, as well as Dr. Camp's Anatomy and Physiology 1. So for this lecture, you're going to be differentiating between anatomy and physiology. What do those terms mean, and what types of things do they apply to? We will also be defining homeostasis, listing some general characteristics of control mechanisms, and I will also give you a couple examples of negative and positive feedback. All right, so let's first get started with anatomy versus physiology. So human anatomy is the study of the body's structures. Okay, so gross anatomy is the study of the larger structures of the body, basically those that are visible without the aid of magnification. So macro means large, so sometimes it's also called macroscopic anatomy. In contrast, microscopic, micro means small, and microscopic anatomy is going to be the study of structures that can be observed only with the use of a microscope or other magnification devices. So, for example, the study of tissues is histology, and the study of the cells that make up tissues is cytology. So cyto is cells. And also ology, that suffix means the study of. All right, so also the relationship of how anatomy appears both at the gross and microscopic levels informs its function. Okay, so relationship of form to function is going to be functional anatomy. So what do I mean by that? So basically, form and function is a concept that applies really to all levels of human organization. For example, the structure of a protein or the form of that protein will inform its function. When a protein does not have the proper structure or form, then it will often have the wrong function, less function, or it may not have any function at all. And so this, of course, applies as we move up that structural hierarchy. When cells do not have the proper form, they may not have, or more likely will not have, the proper function. Same with tissues, organs, etc. Okay. So let's move on to physiology. So physiology, on the other hand, refers to biochemical mechanisms and the way in which these mechanisms support the functions of life. The study of physiology includes observations with both the naked eye and with microscopes, but it also often uses measurements and instruments to take those measurements. It's going to also assess cell and tissue function, organ and organ system functions, maintenance of homeostasis, which is basically the steady state of internal conditions that must be maintained by all living things. Now we're going to talk more about what homeostasis means as we move through this lecture. And there's several different subfields within physiology. So for example, pathophysiology would be the study of diseases or injury process. So the study of anatomy and physiology will make more sense when you continually relate the form of the structures you are studying with their function. So let's look at this picture here of intestine, and let's look at examples of that intestine and what would be an anatomy function, or what would qualify as anatomy and what would qualify as physiology. All right. So here we have what an anatomist would focus on. They would focus on the form and structures of the small intestine, which is what we're looking at here. They would also study the small intestine, including its relationship to the rest of the body. They would describe the multiple layers in the wall of the intestine. They would also study the tissues of the small intestine, and they would also study the cells that compose those tissues. Physiologists, on the other hand, would focus on the function of the small intestine. They would examine how the muscles of the small intestine propel food through the digestive system or tract. The physiologist would describe the mechanisms by which different nutrients are broken down. Physiologists would also study the mechanisms by which different nutrients are absorbed through the small intestine. So basically, anatomists and physiologists are going to look at both the form and function of the small intestines and how those are interrelated. All right, so before we jump into homeostasis, let's first talk about the different types of functions or physiological jobs that are needed for survival. So these are basic processes. I want to talk about basic processes that are performed by all living things. So all living things, and I mean from bacteria to humans, are going to exhibit certain properties. So for one, they all structure themselves. So organisms, even single-celled organisms, are highly organized. Single-celled organisms are going to have membranes, they have atoms that are going to be bunched together to form molecules. Molecules are going to form larger complexes like macromolecules such as DNA. Eukaryotic cells are going to contain structures called organelles, and these are going to organize specific functions, or this is going to be places where specific functions occur within that eukaryotic cell. So there's lots of structure and organization in living organisms. Living organisms also grow and develop. So oftentimes for multicellular organisms, growth means an increase in the number of cells and different cell types. And you also have different types of development that occurs. So for example, humans will undergo a developmental stage known as puberty, but even single-celled organisms undergo development. For example, bacteria will undergo a developmental stage called where they form an endospore. And this is created to withstand harsh environmental conditions. Living organisms reproduce, and they may do so asexually if they're single-celled, or through sexual reproduction, which is what happens with most multicellular organisms. So in this case, we're going to have, for multicellular organisms, they're going to produce specialized cells called gametes. And after fertilization, of course, that will create a genetically complete cell that has DNA from both parents. And of course, the major benefit of this is that it increases the genetic diversity of that species. So in terms of evolution, a species with more genetic diversity is going to be more fit. Organisms that are alive respond to change, meaning they're going to respond to stimuli. An example of this would be plants, which they don't move around, they don't have legs or anything, but they will move or bend toward a source of light, or they can climb on fences or walls. So living organisms are going to respond to change either stimuli either positively or negatively. Living things also defend against threats. For example, every type of cell can be infected with the virus, even bacteria. So, of course, it's not surprising that cells have methods for defending themselves against viral threats. And then, of course, there's homeostasis, which I've mentioned that word already once in this lecture. So organisms require multiple mechanisms to coordinate their internal functions, even if they're simple organisms. They need to respond to stimuli, they need to cope with environmental stresses, and they need to maintain some sort of steady state within each cell and within the organism as a whole. And so this is basically maintaining homeostasis. Now, all of these things that I've talked about here are going to use energy. All living things have some sort of energy transformations that occur. So, and of course, to get energy, they need to take in nutrients. And when organisms take in nutrients, they are going to metabolize those nutrients, and that's going to create waste. Those wastes need to be excreted. And in addition, for energy to be created, there needs to be an exchange of gases. Most organisms, not all, but most organisms require the presence of oxygen to create energy. Cellular energy is in the form of a molecule called ATP. This typically needs oxygen to be created, or at least efficient quantities to be created. And so oxygen needs to be delivered to the cells. And of course, the byproduct of that is going to be CO2, and that needs to be taken away from the cell. So we need to have a gas exchange. We need to have a continual influx of oxygen, and we need the byproduct gas that's created, if that's CO2, that needs to be taken away from the cell as well. And so these are all the processes, very basic processes that occur in all living systems. Now, as the organism becomes more complex in nature, all of these processes also become more complex, and they need there needs to be more involvement of other cell types in these processes. So in the human body, we have several body systems that work together to help us perform all of these different essential functions. So the human body, of course, consists of trillions of cells that are organized into tissues, organs, organ systems, and of course those organ systems are also organized into compartments called cavities. So that gives us our structure and organization. We also have metabolism. So the cells need to metabolize. Every single cell in our body is going to metabolize nutrients and create waste. And so those nutrients need to be delivered. They need to be the body needs to get those nutrients into it, and we need to excrete the waste that results from it. And several body systems are going to be involved in that, including the digestive system, the urinary system, cardiovascular, respiratory. I'm not going to list every single system for each one of these, but I'm going to try to give you at least a few, just so that you can understand that there are several different organ systems or body systems that work together to help us achieve these basic life-needing properties. So growth and development. So growth is typically at its most basic just an increase in cell number, of course, if you're a multicellular organism. And in the human, an increase in cell number, you're going to need, your skeleton will need to increase in size. You're going to need more deposition of bone, minerals. You will also need an increase in the size of the integument, etc. So all the organ systems are going to need to increase to some degree as the human body grows. Then you're also going to have coordination of that, which will often involve hormones and signaling from the endocrine system. Development in the human, you've got things like puberty, and that's going to affect the reproductive system significantly, and it's also going to be joined up by the endocrine system, which will also coordinate that effort as well. The human body obviously is going to respond to changes, and that can include things like sensing and movement. So there's receptors in multiple body systems. Did you just eat? Your stomach's going to need to know food is on the way. Your small intestine has receptors that let the brain know, what processes are going on there. So multiple body systems are going to have receptors that are monitoring changes in internal conditions. Your nervous system is going to be involved in coordination of the responses to these changes, as well as to movement. So when we think about movement, that's going to be the skeletal system, the muscular system. If you need to quickly get out of a situation, you may need to physically move your person. That's going to require multiple systems: the nervous system, the skeletal system, the muscular system. Excuse me. And that's a fight or flight situation. That's going to also involve the endocrine system. We also have to regulate our body systems. Ultimately, that is going to be including maintaining homeostasis. Again, there's receptors and effectors that are involved in this process in multiple body systems. The endocrine system with hormones is involved here, and anytime you have regulation, of course, your nervous system will be involved. What other body systems are involved will just depend on the situation. Reproduction, again, hormones. We're going to have the endocrine system and the reproductive system, just at its most basic. And then protection. The body needs to be protected so that it can continue to grow, so that it can continue to live and ultimately reproduce. So protection will come from immune cells, the integument system, or any other barrier within the body is going to help protect the body from invasion of pathogens. The nervous system will also be involved. For example, you may not just be talking about coordination of the immune system. Again, if there is a fight or flight situation, the nervous system, the endocrine system are going to be involved in that as well. So the take-home message here is that multiple body systems are going to be involved in all of these basic functions. These functions happen on a cellular level, but they also happen on an organism level as well. So now finally, let's move on to homeostasis. So I've said this a couple times. What is homeostasis? A lot of people think it's simply just keeping body conditions the same at all times, and that's really not quite what it is. Nothing is we're not trying to keep everything exactly the same. Is it maintaining a balance of body conditions? That's maybe a little closer, but that's still not quite it. Really, homeostasis means maintaining a relatively stable internal environment. And that's going to be within normal limits. There's going to be fluctuation within these normal limits. It's not the same, but the body wants to try to maintain this internal environment within a certain range. And that'll always be the case, except when we need to adapt to changing internal or external conditions. So what happens when we do have this change that occurs, or this change in our external conditions? Well, there's these homeostatic control loops that help us get our organism, our system, back to the steady state levels we like to maintain them at. So first, what's going to happen is you're going to have a stimulus. A stimulus is simply any change in a variable that is regulated. So this could be a change in temperature. This could be a change in hydration. Okay, and that change is going to be detected by a receptor. A receptor is simply a structure that will detect the stimulus. Once that receptor detects the stimulus, it's going to send that information to the control center. The control center is going to take that information and then send it to an effector. Okay, so the control center sends output information to an effector, and the effector is simply the structure that brings about the change. So different receptors are going to receive information about different stimuli, and therefore different effectors are going to be involved in changing things back depending on the stimuli. So things that are involved in detecting receptors and effectors involved in maintaining stable body temperature are going to be different from receptors and effectors that are involved in maintaining hydration. So ultimately, after the effector brings about change, then homeostasis is now restored. We're back to those steady state levels. So let's talk about negative feedback. Negative feedback is probably the most common way that stimuli from the environment is controlled, or the effects of environmental stimuli are controlled. So what we have is our controlled condition, homeostasis, our steady state level of whatever, body temperature, for example. That condition is going to change, and that change is going to be detected by a receptor. The receptor is going to send that information to a control center. The control center is going to then send information to the effector. It's going to pick the effector it needs to mediate change. And the effector will then reverse the change, bringing us back to our controlled condition. So that is negative feedback. We've had a change occur, and then the way we fixed that change was by reversing it. So it's a negative feedback loop. Here is an example. So in this case, we have someone eating. And so what happens is you eat, the food's digested, and there's going to be glucose released. So blood glucose levels are going to start to rise. And this is what the stimulus is, high blood glucose. That is going to be, that high blood glucose is going to be detected by cells in the pancreas. The pancreas are going to secrete insulin, and that is ultimately going to cause the liver cells to take up glucose and store it as glycogen. Other body cells will also take up glucose. Okay, so that is going to be the effect. That's going to reverse it. So now as the body cells take up blood glucose, the glucose levels in the body or in the blood are going to decline. And so now we have returned to homeostatic blood glucose levels. So the stimulus is the high glucose. The receptor is going to be in the pancreas. The effectors are the cells that start taking up glucose. And the effect is ultimately going to be a return to homeostasis, where we have decreased blood glucose levels. Positive feedback is a little bit different. So positive feedback intensifies a change in the body's physiological condition rather than reversing it. So we're just going to get more and more intense. And so what happens here is we get a deviation from the normal range that results in more and more change, and the system or the body moves further and further away from that normal homeostatic steady state level that the body likes to have. So why would we want to do this? So positive feedback in the body is normal only when there is a definite endpoint. So for an example of this would be childbirth and the body's response to blood loss. These are two examples of positive feedback. So what happens here is you have your controlled condition. The condition is going to change, and that's going to be detected by a receptor. That's going to move to a control center. The control center will send out information to an effector. Okay, so this is just like negative feedback. But instead of reversing the condition, it's actually going to add to the change, which will further cause the condition to change. The receptor will detect that. That will then go back to the control center, then the effector. And this is going to go around and around for as long as it needs to, until finally there's going to be a point where the condition is stopped. And basically this positive feedback is discontinued. Another positive feedback example is breastfeeding. So in this case, you have the stimulus, which is the baby suckling at the breast. The receptor here is going to be sensory receptors in the skin of the breast that detect the suckling. When they detect that, they're going to send impulses to the control center, which is usually the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus is going to signal the posterior pituitary to release oxytocin. Okay. This is going to cause the effector, which is oxytocin, is going to be released into the blood, and this is going to go to the effector, which is going to stimulate milk injection from the breast. So the breast is the effector here, and milk injection means milk is released. And of course, as milk is released, that's going to cause the baby to suckle, which is going to then stimulate, and that's going to be picked up by the receptor, and this is going to continue on and on until the baby is satiated and it stops suckling. Okay, and so then that stimulus is going to be taken away. And that is it for this presentation.